The operational record of this event does not initiate within the secure legislative hearing chambers of Washington. It originates at a static geographic coordinate, a specific nodal point on the military topographical map designated as Porta, situated immediately adjacent to the Kuwaiti border. To accurately evaluate the physical reality of this specific location, it is necessary to eliminate all political rhetoric and focus exclusively on mathematics, topography, and the verified specifications of weapon systems currently deployed in active combat. Porta functions as an infrastructure installation constructed upon an open plain possessing minimal natural geographical shielding. In the rigid vocabulary of military tactics, this constitutes a highly exposed soft target, relying entirely upon artificial defensive architecture and early warning radar networks to maintain operational survivability. The adversary forces operating within this specific theater possess and actively deploy a primary vanguard strike platform, a one-way, kinetic attack unmanned aerial vehicle formally designated as the Shahed 136. Technical analysis applied to the Shahed 136 platform indicates that it does not function as a standard reconnaissance asset. It operates exclusively as a unidirectional cruise munition, specifically engineered to deliver a highly compressed payload of military-grade explosives deliberately combined with tens of thousands of metallic fragments designed to maximize catastrophic physical trauma against unarmored biological targets. Manufacturer specifications and prior combat data confirm that this specific variant of the Shahed maintains an effective operational flight range extending up to several hundred miles. While its internal combustion engine generates a recognizable acoustic signature, its minimal radar cross-section, and its capability to execute terrain-hugging flight profiles render it an exceptionally complex interception problem for standard early warning networks if comprehensive preparation is lacking. The geographic positioning of the Porta installation placed United States military personnel at a strictly calculated distance of exactly under 100 miles from the adversary's operational boundary. When inserting these exact parameters into a spatial equation, the resulting overlap is absolute. The Porta installation resided entirely and deeply within the terminal kill zone of the Shahed system. A distance of under 100 miles dictates that the temporal window from the moment the platform is launched to the moment it achieves target acquisition is violently compressed, reducing the reaction window for any air defense network to a margin measured strictly in minutes. On the 1st of March, the statistical probability of an incoming strike officially intersected with physical reality. A Shahed platform carrying a live payload breached the airspace perimeter and achieved terminal detonation directly inside the compound. The biological and structural consequences of this kinetic event were immediate and have been meticulously documented within military medical records. The detonation sequence generated a high-pressure shock wave, immediately followed by a fragmentation radius expanding at supersonic velocities. Within that specific radius, 6 United States military personnel absorbed physical trauma exceeding all physiological capacities for recovery, resulting in the permanent termination of biological functions. Over 30 additional personnel sustained exceptionally severe levels of physical devastation. The medical evacuation reports coldly documented the mechanical nature of these injuries, traumatic brain injuries, massive arterial hemorrhaging, and shrapnel embedded throughout the human anatomy. Surviving personnel reported blood flooding from lacerated abdominal cavities, while muscle tissue in the upper and lower extremities was violently severed by thousands of molten metal fragments navigating the airspace. This does not represent an abstract medical emergency. It represents the direct application of kinetic shearing force upon the human body entirely devoid of ballistic armor. Under standard operational protocols, when military biological assets are deployed into an environment characterized by a high probability of kinetic threat, They are mandated to be enclosed within a multi-layered defensive architecture. The singular purpose of this architecture is to detect and neutralize enemy kinetic energy before it can intersect with a target. A standard forward operating base demands the presence of a counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar system, a mechanical asset capable of discharging thousands of metallic rounds per minute to construct an impenetrable wall that shreds incoming threats. It demands early warning radar arrays. And at the absolute baseline level, it demands overhead ballistic protection structures, such as reinforced concrete bunkers or T-walls designed to absorb incoming shock waves. However, the physical inventory conducted at the Porta facility on the 1st of March recorded a completely divergent architectural reality. The defensive architecture at this location did not experience a technical malfunction. It was not overwhelmed by a saturated multi-vector attack. The defensive architecture required to preserve the lives of the soldiers simply did not exist. The on-the-ground assessment, provided directly by the surviving personnel, categorized the defensive capabilities at Porta using absolute terminology. The localized defense matrix was classified strictly in the none category. This base matrix contained exactly 0 anti-drone countermeasures. It contained exactly 0 rocket interception batteries. It contained exactly 0 counter-artillery or counter-mortar equipment. Critically, the entire physical infrastructure of the compound lacked foundational overhead protection, a baseline structural requirement that was already considered an essential standard for every soldier during the Iraq conflict 2 decades. Prior. The men and women of the 103rd Sustainment Command were placed into a static geographic position. They were deployed at a location under 100 miles from the adversary. And they were provided with an interception capability that their own unit formally classified as a flat 0. They were positioned perfectly within the crosshairs of the targeting apparatus, and they were systematically stripped by the command structure of the mechanical armor necessary to survive the impact. The 6 resulting fatalities were not the byproduct of an unpredictable weather event or an unforeseeable battlefield anomaly. They were the inevitable mathematical conclusion of deploying soft targets into a lethal kinetic envelope without providing them with a single mechanical tool to deflect the incoming steel. The complete absence of defensive hardware transformed a tactical vulnerability into a predetermined death sentence long before the ignition system of the Shahed was ever activated. Military operations do not materialize within a vacuum, and catastrophic operational failures rarely result from instantaneous, unforeseeable anomalies. They are almost exclusively preceded by a highly detailed, sequentially documented paper trail. To accurately dissect the structural collapse that occurred at the Porta installation, the analysis must shift from the physical impact site backward along the chronological timeline, focusing entirely on the intelligence data generated, processed, and subsequently disregarded in the weeks and months prior to the 1st of March. Within the architecture of modern warfare, intelligence gathering functions as the primary mechanism for risk mitigation. Prior to the initiation of active regional hostilities, the American intelligence apparatus had already conducted a comprehensive threat assessment regarding the geographic coordinates of the Porta compound. This assessment was not based on abstract theory. It was built upon intercepted communications, satellite telemetry, and verified adversary targeting matrices. The resulting internal analysis produced an explicit empirical conclusion regarding the installation. The intelligence community verified that the Porta compound ranked exceptionally high on the adversary's priority target list. The adversary possessed the exact coordinates, understood the strategic value of the location, and maintained the specific kinetic assets required to strike it. Furthermore, the internal military analysis evaluating the defensive viability of the site did not utilize ambiguous or conditional terminology. The official assessment formally categorized the location as completely indefensible from aerial attack. In the strict vocabulary of military planning, the term indefensible possesses a singular mathematical definition. It indicates a 0% probability of successfully intercepting incoming munitions using the baseline architecture available at that specific geographic coordinate. Based upon this absolute calculation, the formal recommendation embedded within the intelligence analysis dictated that the site should not be utilized for the deployment of biological personnel. The data was compiled, the threat was quantified, the vulnerability was explicitly documented. The warning was entered into the official operational record. However, the chronological sequence of events demonstrates a catastrophic systemic override. The empirical data generated by the intelligence apparatus was completely severed from the command decisions executed by the executive military leadership, despite the existence of a verified analysis explicitly warning that the installation was a high-priority target incapable of withstanding aerial bombardment. The deployment directive was authorized. The personnel of the 103rd Sustainment Command received their official orders and were physically transported into the designated threat envelope. They were commanded to occupy a coordinate that their own intelligence network had already mathematically written off as an unviable defensive position. The operational disconnect extended beyond the initial deployment phase. The officers commanding the 103rd Sustainment Command on the ground possessed a direct physical understanding of their immediate environment. Upon occupying the Porta facility, the field commanders visually and technically verified the exact vulnerabilities detailed in the classified assessments. They observed the complete absence of overhead ballistic protection. They noted the lack of counter-unmanned aerial systems and early warning radar arrays. They understood that their units were occupying a highly exposed position, located well under 100 miles from the adversary's launch sites. Operating under established military protocol, these on-the-ground officers initiated the formal bureaucratic process required to secure their perimeter. They transmitted official requests up the chain of command, explicitly requisitioning additional force protection hardware. They filed the paperwork required to obtain the mechanical systems necessary to prevent the exact type of kinetic strike that the intelligence community had already predicted. The legislative hearing conducted by Representative Pat Ryan systematically dismantled the administration's narrative regarding these specific requests. During the sworn testimony, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stated for the official record that wherever humanly possible, force protection and counter-unmanned aerial systems were always made available to deployed units. Representative Ryan immediately introduced the physical reality of the battlefield to invalidate the bureaucratic assertion. The objective historical fact remains that the officers on the ground at Porta requested the defensive systems, and the command structure failed to deliver them. The requested hardware was never transported. The interceptor batteries were never installed. The overhead bunkers were never poured. The requisition forms were processed, and the resulting physical action was an absolute zero. This chronological sequence fundamentally alters the classification of the event that transpired on the 1st of March. When a military command structure possesses prior intelligence explicitly identifying a location as an indefensible primary target, when that command structure deliberately overrides the intelligence and orders hundreds of personnel into that exact location, and when that same command structure subsequently ignores formal, on-the-ground requests from field officers pleading for essential protective hardware, the resulting casualties cannot be categorized as an unpredictable tragedy of war. The intelligence apparatus functioned precisely as engineered. It gathered the necessary data, calculated the trajectory of the threat, and issued the required warnings. The failure was exclusively located within the executive decision-making matrix. The administration actively chose to absorb a maximum level of operational risk, but they transferred the physical consequences of that risk entirely onto the unarmored bodies of the 103rd Sustainment Command. By the time the Shahed 136 drone was launched by the adversary, the fatal outcome was already permanently embedded within the bureaucratic paperwork of the Pentagon. The drone merely served as the kinetic delivery mechanism for a structural failure that the chain of command had actively authored, authorized, and ignored for months prior to the impact. When a catastrophic operational failure occurs within a designated combat theater, the immediate requirement for the presiding military establishment is not strictly limited to battlefield recovery. A secondary simultaneous protocol is immediately activated within the Capitol, the rapid containment of domestic political fallout. To understand the full architecture of the accountability crisis that subsequently unfolded in the legislative chambers, one must critically analyze the specific public relations strategy deployed by the Department of Defense in the immediate aftermath of the strike. The physical setting for this secondary protocol was the primary press briefing room at the Pentagon. The acoustic environment of this specific room is highly controlled, sterile, and entirely insulated from the kinetic realities of the operational theater. It was from this secure podium, 24 hours after 6 military personnel suffered fatal fragmentation trauma, that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth initiated a deliberate campaign to construct a parallel, fabricated reality regarding the events at the Porta installation. In formal communications regarding military operations, vocabulary is not selected at random. Every noun and adjective is algorithmically chosen to project competence, maintain executive authority, and minimize institutional liability. During his initial public address addressing the fatalities, Secretary Hegseth deployed a highly specific sequence of bureaucratic terminology. He explicitly categorized the target location as possessing fortified defenses. He publicly asserted that the defensive posture across the entire theater, including the impact zone, had been completely maximized. Most critically, he provided a specific mechanical classification for the incoming munition that achieved terminal detonation. He did not describe a heavy, one-way cruise munition operating in uncontested airspace. He described the fatal Shahed platform as a squirter that squeaked through. To fully comprehend the magnitude of the deception presented to the public, it is necessary to mathematically deconstruct each of these 3 carefully selected phrases and place them directly against the physical inventory of the Porta facility on the 1st of March. First, the administration utilized the term fortified. In the strict lexicon of military engineering, fortification represents a highly specific, quantifiable physical state. A fortified position requires the presence of poured concrete bunkers, reinforced structural perimeters, blast-resistant barriers, and an interlocking matrix of early warning radar arrays. The physical reality of the Porta base, as established by the surviving units and the prior intelligence assessments, was an absolute 0 in all of these categories. The base contained no concrete overhead protection and 0 radar interception capability. Therefore, the application of the word fortified by the Secretary of Defense was not a public relations exaggeration. It was a deliberate, categorical falsification of a physical environment. Second, the administration asserted that the defensive posture had been maximized. The concept of maximization implies that the command structure had expended every available resource, deployed every available mechanical asset, and reached the absolute upper limit of defensive capability. The reality, documented in the requisition forms filed by the officers on the ground, was that the command structure had actively denied requests for standard, baseline force protection hardware. The defensive posture was not maximized. It was artificially suppressed to a baseline of 0 by the executive decision-making matrix. Third, and perhaps most revealing of the institutional culture within the Pentagon, was the deployment of the phrase, a squirter that squeaked through. In military vernacular, a squirter typically refers to a low-level insurgent fleeing a targeted compound or a minor, negligible anomaly that escapes a wide net. The term is fundamentally designed to minimize the perceived threat and to imply that the overarching defensive net was almost entirely successful. The phrase squeaked through carries a very specific mechanical implication. It implies that a robust, multi-layered defensive shield was actively engaged, that it successfully intercepted the vast majority of incoming kinetic threats, and that only a microscopic fraction of the attack managed to bypass the system due to an unavoidable statistical variance. This linguistic framing was an absolute subversion of the battlefield physics. The Shahed 136 is a massive, highly destructive aerial platform carrying a heavy payload. It did not squeak through a dense defensive net. It flew unimpeded through a completely uncontested airspace, traveling exactly along the trajectory that the intelligence community had previously mapped, and detonated precisely on a target that had zero mechanical capability to stop it. There was no shield for the drone to squeak through because the command structure had never authorized the installation of a shield. The strategic purpose of this specific podium narrative is highly calculating. By packaging a gross command failure within the vocabulary of an unavoidable operational anomaly, the defense establishment attempts to sever the causal link between their deployment orders and the resulting fatalities. If the defenses were truly fortified and maximized, then the deaths of the 6 soldiers can be successfully categorized as a tragic but acceptable byproduct of modern warfare. The blame is transferred from the architects of the deployment directly onto the unpredictable nature of the enemy. This is the exact mechanism by which an executive administration attempts to rewrite the historical record in real time. They utilize the sterile authority of the Pentagon briefing room to overwrite the bloody, chaotic reality of the impact zone. They weaponize bureaucratic language to insulate themselves from political liability, fully expecting that the classified nature of the intelligence assessments and the geographic isolation of the surviving soldiers will prevent the actual data from ever reaching the domestic public. The narrative delivered by Secretary Hegseth was designed to be the final official historical summary of the Porta tragedy. It was structured to close the file, classify the failure as an accident, and allow the executive leadership to maintain their positions of authority without submitting to an operational audit. However, this specific public relations protocol contained a fatal flaw. It relied entirely on the assumption that the personnel who actually absorbed the kinetic impact of the Shahed drone would remain silent and that the legislative branch would accept the fabricated vocabulary without demanding the physical receipts. That assumption was mathematically invalidated the moment Representative Pat Ryan initiated his questioning. The sterile architecture of a congressional hearing room is specifically engineered to insulate its occupants from the physical realities of combat. The environment operates on filtered intelligence summaries, generalized strategic assessments, and the carefully sanitized vocabulary of the executive branch. To successfully dismantle a fabricated narrative generated by the Department of Defense, an interrogator must physically transport the unedited data of the impact zone directly into that insulated chamber. Representative Pat Ryan, operating with the methodological precision of a military veteran, did not enter the hearing utilizing abstract political theory. He bypassed the heavily redacted chain of command and initiated the formal injection of primary source data into the congressional record. This primary source data consisted exclusively of the direct transcribed testimonies of the biological assets who actually absorbed the kinetic impact at the Porta installation. Representative Ryan commenced his procedural audit by entering a highly specific medical description into the public record. He recited the exact transcription of a surviving soldier detailing the immediate aftermath of the Shahed drone detonation: head wounds, heavy bleeding, and shrapnel distributed across the operational area, resulting in personnel hemorrhaging from their abdomens, their upper extremities, and their lower extremities. This quotation was not a dramatic interpretation. It was a rigid anatomical catalog of the physical shearing forces applied to unarmored human tissue. Following the recitation of this specific trauma catalog, Representative Ryan directed a binary inquiry to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, asking if the Secretary could identify the origin of the quotation. The Secretary of Defense responded by stating for the official record that he was not sure that he did. This specific exchange requires rigorous analytical attention. The Chief Executive Officer of the Pentagon, the individual possessing ultimate operational responsibility for the deployment and the physical preservation of tens of thousands of American troops, could not identify the desperate, first-hand operational report generated by his own surviving personnel following a mass casualty event. The executive disconnect was total. The administration possessed the capacity to define the attack from a briefing podium, but demonstrated an absolute inability to recognize the physical reality of the blast radius. Representative Ryan immediately proceeded to the second phase of his evidentiary presentation. He introduced a tactical assessment of the Porta perimeter, generated not by a Pentagon analyst, but by a soldier stationed at the precise coordinate of the impact. The surviving personnel formally categorized the drone defense capability of the installation as residing exclusively in the none category. The testimony systematically dismantled the physical inventory of the base. It confirmed the absolute absence of counter-drone capabilities. It confirmed the absolute absence of counter-rocket systems. It confirmed the absolute absence of counter-mortar and counter-artillery hardware. Furthermore, Representative Ryan utilized this testimony to highlight a severe, mathematically verifiable regression in standard military engineering. The quotation explicitly noted that the personnel at Porta completely lacked the basic overhead ballistic protection that was issued as a mandatory baseline requirement during the Iraq conflict exactly 20 years prior. This comparison is structurally critical. 2 decades ago, the military apparatus recognized that deploying soft targets into a kinetic environment necessitated the physical pouring of concrete overhead to absorb vertical fragmentation trajectories. At the Porta installation, operating well under 100 miles from an adversary, possessing advanced aerial munitions, that fundamental survival geometry was completely abandoned. The troops were essentially placed into a geographic depression and exposed entirely to the open atmosphere. Having established the absolute absence of mechanical defense, Representative Ryan then utilized the survivor's ledger to systematically execute the destruction of the Pentagon's official public narrative. The administration had previously asserted that the drone was merely a variable that squeaked through a fortified position. Representative Ryan entered the direct refutation into the record. He quoted a surviving soldier, explicitly stating to a major broadcast network that painting a picture that one squeaked through is a falsehood. He quoted a second survivor confirming that the unit was completely unprepared to provide any defense for itself, and that the coordinate was fundamentally not a fortified position. He quoted a third survivor assessing the structural protection of the installation as being about as weak as one gets. These specific quotations operate as precision munitions directed against the bureaucratic infrastructure of Washington. The surviving personnel are not engaging in political theater. They are providing the raw, empirical data necessary to prosecute a command failure. They are officially confirming that it is physically impossible for a munition to squeak through a defensive architecture that does not exist. They are confirming that the term fortified cannot be applied to a perimeter possessing the weakest structural parameters mathematically possible. By entering these exact phonetic transcriptions into the official congressional ledger, Representative Ryan forced the executive branch into an inescapable physical confrontation. He utilized the objective reality of the blast zone as a mechanical lever to pry open the sanitized containment vessel the Department of Defense had constructed. The 6 fatalities were no longer abstract data points logged in a casualty report. Their operational environment had been reconstructed parameter by parameter in front of the entire Legislative Oversight Committee. The truth regarding the Porta installation was no longer isolated in the Middle East. It had been successfully transported and permanently deposited onto the desk of the Secretary of Defense. A successful interrogation conducted within a legislative oversight committee does not rely upon the deployment of open-ended inquiries. Open-ended inquiries provide the executive branch with the structural parameters required to execute a tactical retreat into bureaucratic ambiguity. A definitive interrogation requires the construction of a rigid, mathematical logic trap. The interrogator must assemble two mutually exclusive sets of empirical data, place them into direct opposition, and force the target to publicly align with one variable while simultaneously destroying the other. Representative Pat Ryan, having successfully entered the unfiltered primary source data into the congressional record, proceeded to execute this exact structural maneuver. In the lexicon of tactical geometry, this maneuver is classified as a pincer movement. The architecture of the trap was meticulously calibrated. Representative Ryan had previously established Variable A, the official narrative generated by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth from the Pentagon briefing room. Variable A asserted that the defensive posture at the Porta installation had been maximized, that the perimeter was fortified, and that the single Shahed 136 drone was merely an anomaly that squeaked through a robust interception net. Representative Ryan had subsequently established Variable B, the unedited, transcripted testimonies of the biological assets who actually absorbed the kinetic detonation. Variable B asserted that the installation possessed zero counter-drone capabilities, zero counter-rocket systems, zero overhead ballistic protection, and was explicitly described by the surviving personnel as residing entirely within the none category for defensive preparation. The physical reality of the universe dictates that Variable A and Variable B cannot coexist. A geographic coordinate cannot simultaneously possess a maximized, fortified defense matrix and an absolute absence of overhead armor. A kinetic munition cannot simultaneously squeak through a dense interception net and fly entirely unopposed into a completely unprotected target zone. One data set represents the objective truth of the operation. The other data set represents a deliberate, calculated fabrication. Representative Ryan formalized this contradiction for the official record. He directed his focus to the Secretary of Defense and highlighted the absolute intersection of the two narratives. He noted that the direct testimony of the survivors fundamentally classified the Pentagon's official statement as a falsehood. He quoted the personnel describing the compound as entirely unprepared to provide any defense for itself. Then, having successfully sealed all lateral escape routes, Representative Ryan triggered the primary mechanism of the logic trap. He issued a strictly binary inquiry requiring a definitive classification of the primary source data. He asked, "Are you saying that these soldiers, our soldiers, who survived this horrific attack are lying?" This specific formulation is the defining mechanism of the pincer movement. It eliminates the capability of the executive target to rely upon the standard protocols of administrative deflection. The Secretary of Defense was mathematically forced to process a dual vector assault, where both available vectors resulted in immediate institutional catastrophe. To fully understand the severity of this procedural lock, one must analytically deconstruct the two available options presented to the Secretary. Option 1 required the Secretary of Defense to answer in the affirmative. Selecting this option would require the chief executive of the military establishment to publicly state, under oath, that combat veterans who had recently absorbed severe fragmentation trauma in a designated hostile environment were committing perjury. It would require the Pentagon to officially accuse bleeding, hospitalized soldiers of fabricating data regarding the absence of their own armor. In the context of domestic military politics, executing Option 1 guarantees an immediate, violent institutional revolt across the armed forces and triggers instantaneous, bipartisan political execution. It is a mathematically unviable parameter. Option 2 required the Secretary of Defense to answer in the negative. Selecting this option would require the Secretary to acknowledge that the surviving soldiers were providing an accurate, factual assessment of the physical environment. Acknowledging that the soldiers were telling the truth immediately validates Variable B. Validating Variable B provides absolute confirmation that the Porta base possessed zero defenses, zero artillery interception, and zero overhead protection. Critically, validating Variable B simultaneously achieves the total destruction of Variable A. If the soldiers are telling the truth, then the Secretary of Defense must officially admit that he utilized the primary briefing room of the Pentagon to distribute a fabricated narrative to the global public. He must admit that he deliberately characterized a defenseless slaughter as a fortified anomaly. He must confess to actively rewriting the historical record of a mass casualty event to protect the executive command structure from legal and political liability. Option 2 is an explicit admission of extreme command negligence coupled with a coordinated cover-up. It is equally a mathematically unviable parameter. The trap was executed flawlessly. Representative Ryan engineered a scenario where the presiding authority of the defense apparatus was stripped of all operational camouflage. The standard vocabulary utilized to obscure military failures, terms invoking the fog of war, operational security, or ongoing internal investigations, was completely neutralized by the direct simplicity of the binary question. When an executive official who is entirely accustomed to dictating the parameters of reality is suddenly forced into an airtight logical construct engineered by an adversary, the resulting physiological and political reaction is highly predictable. The operational processing speed of the target drops to zero. The cognitive architecture required to maintain the fabricated narrative experiences a critical failure. The target realizes that they are no longer controlling the interrogation. They are merely occupying the center of the impact zone, waiting for the inevitable detonation of the data they can no longer suppress. When the binary trap successfully detonates within a legislative oversight proceeding, the observable result is not limited to verbal hesitation or administrative silence. It manifests as a verifiable physiological reaction from the target. The Secretary of Defense, an individual entirely accustomed to operating within absolute command environments where his directives are unchallenged, lost his operational composure. The acoustic environment of the hearing room documented a distinct rising octave in his vocal delivery. Instead of providing a calculated executive response to the empirical data presented regarding the complete absence of defensive hardware, the Secretary resorted to shouting directly over a seated member of the legislative branch. In behavioral analysis of high-ranking officials, this specific loss of emotional control and elevation in vocal projection functions as the ultimate visual confirmation that the individual recognizes they have fundamentally lost the structural argument. Unable to logically reconcile the zero defense reality of the Porta installation with his prior public claims of a highly fortified perimeter, Secretary Hegseth initiated a classic Washington deflection tactic. He executed a frantic rhetorical pivot away from the specific impact zone and attempted to aggressively force the legislative conversation into a macroscopic perspective. He loudly stated for the Congressional record that there was a much larger picture at play within the operational theater. He argued that this larger regional picture included integrated air defenses and concrete bunkers. He then introduced a completely new numerical metric into the exchange, asserting that the command structure had successfully moved 7,500 troops off their bases, effectively removing them from the designated target zone, which he referred to in tactical terminology as the X. Furthermore, he explicitly stated that this mass relocation occurred because the military establishment possessed accurate intelligence regarding exactly what the adversary was going to attempt to strike. The mechanical nature of this specific deflection requires precise analytical deconstruction. The Secretary of Defense was attempting to utilize the successful relocation of 7,500 personnel in other geographic sectors as a statistical shield. He was attempting to use a macroscopic administrative success to mathematically counterbalance the microscopic fatal negligence that occurred at the Porta coordinate. This operational logic is fundamentally flawed and structurally invalid. The lives of 6 individuals violently terminated at one specific installation cannot be offset by numerical figures representing personnel located somewhere else. The tactic deployed by the Pentagon's chief executive is the direct equivalent of a maritime captain loudly boasting to an oversight committee that the upper decks of the Titanic are currently dry, while actively demanding that the committee ignore the massive structural breach that is actively sinking the stern of the vessel. Furthermore, in his attempt to pivot, the Secretary inadvertently introduced data that validated Representative Ryan's core assertion by loudly confirming that the Pentagon successfully moved thousands of troops because they possess precise intelligence regarding the adversary's targeting parameters. The Secretary confirmed that the intelligence network was functioning perfectly. The administration knew exactly where the strikes would occur. Yet, possessing that exact intelligence, they deliberately left the 103rd Sustainment Command stationed at Porta, less than 100 miles from the launch point, without a single piece of defensive hardware. As his deflection protocol began to collapse under its own structural weight, the Secretary escalated his acoustic assault. He directly accused Representative Ryan of attempting to monologue falsehoods all over the place. This represents a standard psychological projection tactic frequently utilized within political combat, accusing the interrogator of executing the exact fabrication that the executive branch has already been proven to be committing. Representative Ryan, possessing the operational training required to maintain absolute focus under hostile fire, refused to allow the Secretary to steer the conversation away from the 6 flag-draped coffins that resulted directly from the indefensible command decision. He did not engage with the macroscopic distraction regarding the 7,500 troops. He immediately recognized the increase in vocal volume not as a display of authority, but as a mechanical symptom of institutional panic. He neutralized the acoustic assault with a simple, devastating observation of the physical reality occurring within the chamber. He commanded the Secretary to stop. He formally reclaimed his time. He then stated clearly for the official record, "Just because you yell does not make you right." He repeated the phrase a second time, ensuring the acoustic documentation of the Secretary's loss of control was permanently cemented into the congressional transcript. Just because you yell does not make you right. This specific countermeasure officially terminated the executive branch's attempt to dominate the auditory environment. Representative Ryan explicitly identified the volume increase as an illegitimate substitute for factual accuracy. Having successfully shut down the deflection protocol, he locked the focus of the hearing entirely back onto the surviving personnel. He stated that on behalf of those survivors, the Secretary had just classified their direct primary source testimonies regarding the absence of armor as a falsehood. The trap remained closed, the deflection had been neutralized, and the Secretary was forced back into the center of the impact zone, completely out of operational options. When Representative Pat Ryan successfully neutralized the acoustic assault and firmly reclaimed the auditory environment of the legislative chamber, the resulting silence did not merely signify the defeat of a singular executive official. The stabilization of the room's acoustic parameters marked a critical transition in the structural focus of the hearing. The interrogation ceased to function solely as an audit of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's individual competence. It immediately expanded into a comprehensive forensic autopsy of the entire executive military establishment. The physical data exposed during the exchange revealed an institutional architecture that is fundamentally compromised. To accurately process the magnitude of this failure, one must analytically deconstruct the operational culture, currently dictating the decision-making matrix within the Pentagon. This specific institutional culture operates upon a highly predictable, mathematically asymmetrical equation. Representative Ryan formally identified this equation as a system accustomed to privatizing success while passing the buck on responsibility. The mechanics of this asymmetrical equation were perfectly demonstrated by the Secretary's own aborted deflection protocol. When the central command structure successfully utilizes intelligence data to relocate 7,500 military personnel out of a designated target zone, the executive leadership immediately claims absolute ownership of that data. They privatize the success. They utilize the successful maneuver to validate their own operational competence, their strategic foresight, and their inherent fitness for supreme command. Conversely, when the exact same intelligence apparatus explicitly warns that the Porta installation is indefensible, and the executive leadership overrides that intelligence, deliberately stranding the 103rd Sustainment Command in a zero-defense perimeter, the ownership equation is violently inverted. The Executive Corps immediately initiates the socialization of the failure. They sever the causal link between their deployment signature and the impact zone. The liability for the resulting catastrophe is mechanically passed downward through the hierarchical chain of command. It is pushed further and further from the sterile offices of Washington until it possesses nowhere else to travel, ultimately terminating upon the unarmored biological forms of the deployed personnel. The soldiers are forced to physically absorb the kinetic consequences of an executive gamble that the leadership fundamentally refused to underwrite. This specific operational dynamic represents a total, verifiable breach of the foundational military contract. Within the architecture of a volunteer military force, the relationship between the biological asset and the central command structure is not governed by abstract emotion. It is governed by a rigid procedural contract. The parameters of this contract are absolute. The personnel agree to occupy hostile geographic coordinates, effectively surrendering their biological autonomy and willingly entering environments characterized by a high probability of lethal kinetic exchange. In reciprocal exchange for this surrender, the executive command structure is mathematically obligated to provide maximum mechanical mitigation. The command is required to process accurate intelligence, deploy interlocking layers of early warning radar, provide counter-artillery hardware, and construct overhead ballistic barriers. The command is obligated to reduce the probability of biological termination to the absolute lowest variable physically possible. The events documented at the Porta installation confirm that this foundational contract was deliberately voided by the executive branch. Pushing troops into a designated dead zone, systematically stripping them of all mechanical armor, and denying the subsequent requisition request generated by field officers is not a tactical miscalculation. It is not a variable inherent to the fog of war. It is an intentional, premeditated betrayal of the uniform. The first failure, the deployment into an unprotected coordinate, constituted severe operational negligence. However, the second failure, the coordinated deployment of a fabricated narrative from the primary briefing podium of the Pentagon, constituted an irreversible institutional collapse. When the Secretary of Defense utilized his executive authority to publicly categorize an unprotected slaughter as a minor anomaly that merely squeaked through fortified defenses, he provided objective proof of a systemic rot. The fabrication was a calculated maneuver designed to overwrite the reality of the battlefield, to protect political careers located thousands of miles away from the fragmentation radius. If the apex of the military hierarchy possesses the institutional willingness to deliberately falsify the existence of defense matrices and simultaneously possesses the willingness to classify the verified testimonies of surviving wounded personnel as falsehoods, The entire structural integrity of the Department of Defense is mathematically invalidated. A military apparatus cannot physically function if the personnel deployed in the vanguard cannot trust the empirical reality of the orders transmitted by the rear guard. If a soldier is informed that their position is fortified, but the physical geometry of their compound dictates that they possess zero overhead protection, the chain of command ceases to be a mechanism for coordinated defense and becomes an active threat to survival. Representative Ryan utilized the unedited data of the Porta installation to surgically expose this institutional rot. The hearing room was no longer merely processing the events of the 1st of March. The Legislative Committee was actively processing the collapse of the ethical and procedural membrane that separates a functional, disciplined military hierarchy from a catastrophic, self-serving bureaucracy. The realization permeated the acoustic space of the chamber. The threat to American military personnel did not emanate solely from the Shahed 136 drones launched by the adversary. A secondary, equally lethal threat was actively emanating from the executive offices located within their own capital. Accountability, as noted in the operational analysis, inevitably dies in the shadows of closed rooms. The structural objective of the hearing was to drag that accountability into the center of the legislative floor, lock it under the highest intensity of public illumination, and execute a formal audit of the system that allowed 6 individuals to be traded for a strategic calculation that possessed zero mathematical validity. The terminal phase of a high-stakes legislative audit is not characterized by the pursuit of further information. Once the structural contradictions have been exposed and the executive deflection protocols have been acoustically neutralized, the hearing enters the stage of the final reckoning. This phase functions as the formal closing of the ledger, where the accumulated empirical data regarding command failure is converted into a direct demand for political and institutional termination. Representative Pat Ryan, having methodically deconstructed the fabricated podium narrative and locked the Secretary of Defense into a pincer movement of his own making, initiated the final sequence of the proceeding. He did not offer the Secretary an opportunity for further administrative clarification, nor did he allow for a return to the macroscopic statistics regarding other troop movements. He directed the focus of the chamber back to the singular, unalterable truth of the impact zone. The closing maneuver utilized by Representative Ryan was a deliberate reclamation of justice for the personnel of the 103rd Sustainment Command. He introduced one final primary source quotation into the record, sourced directly from a survivor of the strike. The testimony stated for the permanent record that telling the truth is important and that the nation will not learn from these mistakes if the leadership pretends these mistakes did not happen. This specific quotation provides the moral and procedural foundation for the demand that followed. It identifies the administration's campaign of squeak-through fabrications, not merely as a public relations error, but as a systemic barrier to military reform. If the Pentagon refuses to acknowledge the physical reality of a zero defense perimeter, it guarantees that the exact same vulnerability will be replicated in future theaters, ensuring the continued unnecessary termination of biological assets. Representative Ryan then delivered the terminal comparison of the hearing. He addressed Secretary Hegseth directly and stated, "Those soldiers told the truth. Those soldiers are braver than you are." In the rigid hierarchy of military culture, this is the ultimate categorical condemnation. It strips the Secretary of the perceived moral authority required to hold supreme command. It establishes that the personnel in the vanguard possess the fortitude to confront both the kinetic assault of the adversary and the subsequent political assault of their own leadership, while the leadership in Washington lacked the fortitude to simply acknowledge the physical reality of their own command decisions. The final procedural act of the reckoning was the ironclad demand for resignation. Representative Ryan noted that he had issued this demand exactly 1 year prior, and he formalized it again under the weight of the new evidence. He stated that on behalf of the survivors and the 6 individuals who could no longer speak, the Secretary of Defense was required to resign immediately. The hearing concluded not with a resolution, but with a definitive erasure of the Secretary's executive credibility. The bloody receipts introduced by Ryan, the head wounds, the abdominal hemorrhaging, and the absolute none category of defense remained deposited on the record as a permanent refutation of the Pentagon's spin. Transparency had functioned as the best disinfectant, dragging a lethal command failure out of the shadows of the Pentagon podium and into the broad daylight of public accountability. The broader lesson of this 8-part audit is absolute. In a democratic system, the military contract is built upon the premise that those who order the deployment must underwrite the risk with truth and armor. When the armor is stripped away by negligence and the truth is overwritten by fabrications, the authority of the command is mathematically voided. The 6 flag-draped coffins from the Porta installation serve as the physical evidence of a betrayal that no amount of shouting or administrative deflection can ever hope to obscure. Accountability always arrives. The only remaining variable is the speed at which a system can excise the leadership that put its own seat of power above the lives of the soldiers it was sworn to protect.